In my mid-20s, I read a book that contained so many of the answers I had been searching for. The American author was relatively unknown, although he received much praise for this book, including from Robert Nisbet and many others. He was a Christian, but his arguments were purely biological, philosophical, and sociological, and his reasoning was exceptionally sharp throughout the book. There was not a single argument that he attributed to a supernatural authority. This masterpiece on the origins of human nature was incredible to me. It is one of the most fundamental attacks on the Enlightenment as well, though very balanced and gentle, sometimes even very funny. Yet he remains virtually unknown to the general public. He wrote only 2 or 3 books, the first of which was by far the most important. His name is Thomas Fleming, a classicist, and the book is titled The Politics of Human Nature, first published in 1988. His book was of great importance to my book The Triads, as were the ideas of Peter Sloterdijk, Bernard Sombart, Robert Nisbet, and even someone like Denis de Rougemont. They turned philosophy into a playground of ideas for me. The joy of thinking gripped me. What fundamentally struck me in Fleming's book was the holistic view of reality, nothing less than a breath of fresh air after all that postmodern, deconstructive and fragmentary philosophy focused on well-being and feel-good thinking that dominates universities and the media. Everything is connected to everything else. And when it doesn't seem that way, it's because you aren't looking hard enough. My basic idea for starting this interview was his book from 1988, and my introduction to one of the heroes of my philosophical youth. The book has lost none of its value and will captivate today's readers as much as it did in 1988, or me in the 2000s.
Ah, beautiful.
Is there a better place for a conversation than a rooftop terrace in Pisa, near the Leaning Tower and the magnificent cathedral, to discuss the ancients, the classics, the soul, human nature, and the paths to knowledge and salvation? Such a setting undeniably sets the tone for the conversation. I have a conversation with someone who is not very well known in the rights, in the European rights, although you are well connected with other American and European right-wing philosophers, Catholic philosophers.
Catholic and pagan.
Catholic and pagan, yes. Okay. That makes it more complete. The first moment I heard from you was with this book, your first publication on your own, I think, The Politics of Human Nature from 1988.
Yes.
And it was one of the most mind-blowing, and still is one of the most mind-blowing books for me, because it is a conservative classic, very much, and it is about human nature. And in these days now we see feminism and wokeism and the LGBTQ world popping up. Actually, did you saw this coming 40 years ago?
Well, yes, I had spent my adolescence and my college years and graduate school years in the Deep South in the United States, where people took things for granted much as they would have 150 years earlier. And when I began to hear and read some of the early feminists, both in France and the United States, at first I thought it was some sort of joke. But as I became acquainted with American conservatives, through National Review, a magazine I did not particularly like, although there were years in which I wrote for it, it seemed to me that they were simply had adhered to a theory of classical liberalism, very much like libertarianism, and that they had no foundation for what they believed. I would ask a liberal or libertarian businessman, well, what is it you would sacrifice in order to get what you really want? And they would say, well, liberty is what I really want. And I once had a discussion with the great Milton Friedman, who wrote a book called, I mean, it was through letters. And he said, well, the answer is you're free to choose. And I said, but Milton, free to choose what? Choose to be Jack the Ripper or a child molester, or free to choose a life of decency and moral responsibility and happiness. And everything was speculative. And it seemed to me that unless you found a grounding in reality, the way human beings really are, historically as we know them, or we know them through the literature of other centuries, through the classical literature, which I was devoted to studying, or what we know of the medieval period, or even of the Chinese, or of the Japanese, or of what anthropology tells us of simpler societies in Africa, or North America before the arrival of Europeans. And there's a convergence of the way these people behave. Oh yes, there are different forms of family life, but they all have family lives. They all have something like marriage. They have distinctive sex roles.
Yes.
All of these things can be shown to exist in reality. And it seemed to me that unless you start with reality as opposed to starting with a theory, you can't possibly arrive at any conclusion that would be persuasive.
There are very remarkable side notes in your book. Somewhere you say like that, that the modern philosophy has no answer to modern problems. Why is it?
Because it starts with speculation. For example, if you look at the beginning of the problem, that is people like Descartes and his French disciples, John Locke and Adam Smith, the people who would be cited as the founding fathers of ethics, or look at Marx and his disciples. They all begin, it's like the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator, although Jefferson didn't like that phrase, creator, with certain inalienable rights. All of that, it's simply nonsense on the surface. And a child should know better than that. And yet, and as a student of Aristotle, which as a classicist, as a Greek scholar, although my primary emphasis was on Greek tragedy, I had studied Greek philosophy seriously. Aristotle begins with the observable reality of human nature. And the only philosopher in the British tradition who really does that strongly is David Hume. And they both reach conclusions that are remarkably similar, and by the way, to each other, and similar to what the Christian tradition is taught. I argued, although I was a Christian when I wrote the book, I tried to argue from a purely natural perspective rather than argue from revelation. But it's extraordinary to what degree scriptural texts lined up with, say, the anthropological evidence on the one hand, and also the scientific evidence.
But I have to say that the power of your book is indeed that you show how biblical tradition completes the nature itself.
Yes.
But also all the strong evidences you bring up from nature in morals, in biology, even economics, and then of course philosophy. It's remarkable that you in the 80s. I actually wonder, what did you trigger to write a book? I think until this time, until this moment, 1988, has not been written.
Yes. Actually, I began thinking about because I've been imbued with Greek habits of thought from studying classical antiquity. And a Greek would always ask, what's the beginning of something? Who was the god or hero who first created something? And so I began to be interested in how I'd read all these political anthropologists and political theorists on the origin of the state, a word that is very much abused.
Yeah.
And because in my view, the state was created by Italians in the 13th and 14th century. The Romans didn't have a state.
Okay.
But set that aside. Here we're at the center. It was places like Pisa, Siena, and Florence which began to create the mechanisms by which the state. But how did people lead a social life? Because if you accept the state of nature theory, that we were a bunch of either wild savages killing each other or very nice people getting along, but there were some inconveniences, and then we got together and agreed to play by a certain rule book. There have been instances where civilized people did this. The Pilgrims who came to America on the Mayflower, they wrote up a Mayflower Compact, but they came out of a long tradition. So everything I read seemed to me to presuppose a sort of theory that they accepted, and the theory was obviously couldn't be proved. And so a friend of mine who was a sociologist suggested I start doing some anthropology, and a friend who was a biologist said, you really should be reading the sociobiologists. And I embedded myself in reading the works of E.O. Wilson and everybody else. And I got to know Wilson pretty well, and he once wrote me a very nice letter. He said, I know you're a Christian, and at every point in your book, I was expecting you to flinch, to blink, to say, to back off. But he said, you've never done that. You've always followed the scientific argument to its conclusions.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any other way to do it. You can't cheat.
Yeah. It's very strict in that way. And it could be a weakness in other publications, other authors who might be stronger when they let the religious argument out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially Protestants. They have some strong arguments on sexuality and biology, but they always have to bring in the Bible from beginning to the end, and that's the authority. What is your ultimate authority in your philosophy?
Writing as a philosopher or a philosophically minded historian or classical philologist, my object is always to trace origins and to find what, whether I like it or not, is reality. It's a search for reality. Thomas Aquinas was the greatest Catholic philosopher, was in something of a bind because, on the one hand, he argues as a natural philosopher most of the time, but he does take the truths of revealed religion as a given, and you cannot escape. And as a Christian, I take that point of view in my personal life, but in writing, until I had proved to my own satisfaction that Christianity is consistent with an entirely rational and scientific point of view, I couldn't take anything for granted. Now I don't have to make that argument. I made it in this book, and I can write more openly as a person of faith.
Yeah. Okay. So we come later to your more recent books, but this start of a philosopher is so convincing in many ways. Tracing back religion to nature and defining nature, what it is.
Yeah.
Why do so many philosophers are so easily satisfied with exceptions that prove their skepticism or that prove their whatever they like? Because you show us many times actually that many of the modern assumptions on nature, human nature, biology, that people like to get away with exceptions rather than, how do you call it? It's not uniformity, but you say, you make remarks about universalism versus uniformity.
Yes. Well,
something is universal, and it still means that there could be exceptions.
That's right. Well, if there are, one thing I tell people in practical politics, for example, if you have concluded that people enter politics, at least in the past 500 years, in order to gain wealth, power, and access to women, which is why guerrillas enter politics, and it's why early man entered politics, and political people haven't changed, then if you come across, well, my politician, my political leader, he's different. He believes in goodness and truth, and he is a saint, whether he's Donald Trump or Macron or whatever. And I've just tried to explain, look, if a rule is true, it's true. There can be, historically, there can be variations in societies which prize civic virtue. But even in a society like ancient Athens, Pericles was a man who did great damage to his city by his cynical opportunism. And so you can't, again, an essential thinker is Machiavelli, because Machiavelli never flinches, never blinks. He looks at people who are either ruthless on the one hand or who are pious on the other, but he sees the same old Adam acting the way Adam always acts, seeking wealth, power, women, greater access to resources, prestige, and that doesn't change.
And what does that old Adam bring to humanity?
A need to be corrected constantly. But you see, in the
But
British,
then it's when he is not corrected by others,
Yeah.
who does?
well, this is why if there is no transcendent, if there's nothing beyond man's perception of himself and of his desires, if there's no external check, either in reason, which is not something he invents but has to accept, or in terms of a religious system or a tradition, then man becomes an animal. Aristotle once said that people who tried to rise above human nature must either become gods or sink below nature and become animals. And that is unfortunately what all of these utopian adventures have meant. Long before the French Revolution, we could see it. We could see this in Montaigne and in Rousseau. And Rousseau is the classic. He begins his first great work, the essay on equality, with, well, let us begin by setting aside the facts. And that is, in fact,
Yeah.
what philosophy in the past, since the Enlightenment, has done. You begin by setting aside human reality.
And then finding out new facts. What does he want? What does he want to gain with that?
Yes. Well, he gains a lot in the sense that he can represent himself as a morally superior human being who discharges all his moral responsibilities, but he won't pay for his wife and children and puts them on welfare. He throws them on charity, and then he goes to England to meet David Hume. He goes to Scotland, and finally, when Hume refuses to become his slave, he takes out advertisements in newspapers saying, the Scottish philosopher David Hume is persecuting me.
Did Rousseau that?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. Well, the man is mad. The man is mad.
It's far beyond embarrassing. I never heard about that. So, in the end, you say, or I assume that you say that modern philosophers are led by their imperfections, while classical philosophers ignore these imperfections and strive for beauty, truth, and goodness.
It's certainly they made the effort, and they made the effort to see beyond themselves, beyond their senses, beyond their everyday experience, and in terms of ethics and politics, Aristotle is the beginning of wisdom because he began by collecting facts, by observing nature. He was by background a natural scientist. And there has to be some element of that. You have to establish it's like any scientist today, any real scientist, begins by observation and then gradually forms hypotheses that he tests. And you have to be open to the idea that your favored theory, if tested against reality, can be proved false.
You mentioned Aristotle a couple of times. I haven't heard you about Plato, which is I read your book, so I know. But it's a very good point to talk about why Plato is still remarkable and still a fantastic philosopher.
Yes.
But why is he so much, not misunderstood, but even mistaken? His ideas are, you see them in many esoteric societies. Not even now or in the last centuries, but also in the antique Rome period, you see a lot of esoteric societies coming up with Platonic ideas that feed their Hermetic philosophies.
Yes, yes.
And it's happening over and over again.
Right.
Except in the medieval periods. So in the Middle Ages, you see less Platonic thought, more Christian thought, and in the end, openness to Aristotle. How do you explain that?
Plato was trying to grapple with things that no one had done before. Parmenides had shown that reality was not could not be captured by the senses. That reality was single and unchanging, unmoving. It has no origin. It has no ending. And of course, he was really defining divinity.
Thank you.
And on the other hand, we have a world of illusion and change. And Plato was trying to find various hypotheses, like his theory of forms or ideas, by which you could say this world is a reflection of a more real world. And all of that is excellent. Where Plato becomes dangerous is where he too easily applies this method to the everyday world of art. So, for example, well, poets are liars, therefore they must be got rid of. Or the family, it's an impediment to justice. And this is where his greatest student, accepting most of Plato's metaphysics and altering it somewhat, but Aristotle, in applying this, understands you always have to come to grips with what man is capable of. You can't, imagine if I said to you, well, as a Platonist, I have figured out that man can jump off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which I'm looking at right out there. And I gave you a series of theoretical discussions. And if you actually tried to put this into place, you would be dead very quickly. There's a famous ancient story of somebody who read Plato's dialogue on the soul, his essay on the soul, which doesn't exist. And so he jumped off a mountaintop to see if it was true.
He was very open-minded.
Yes. And that's why the beginning of wisdom in politics and ethics, there have been many wise people in the past, but the beginning of systematic wisdom comes with Aristotle, and you see Plato, who both revered Aristotle and Cicero, but you see this come about in Plato, you see it in Thomas Aquinas, you see it not just in the Aristotelian tradition per se, but in the tradition of rational science that is coming to first observable reality. Unfortunately, Platonism went through many forms. Some of it was skeptical, and then it turned back to Platonic mysticism. And this was fine with Plato and Porphyry. St. Augustine says at one point that surely Plato and Plotinus were guided by the Holy Spirit. Otherwise, they could not have found out so many things that were true.
Yeah.
True according to Christianity. But then unfortunately, in the later empire, there were these convergence of different traditions: Egyptian mysticism, the Babylonian, Persian, all of these things coming together in Gnostic movements or the Manichaean movements, and they would take Plato and put his works to the most bizarre, twisted applications. And so it begins largely with Iamblichus, and it moves on, and it becomes it's a long tradition of very bad ideas, but it promised power. It promised power, and it promised that if you died and knew the right words to say when you were dead and going through the various spheres, the demons would try to stop you, but you would use the magic phrases that you knew, and you could defeat these angelic demons.
Yeah.
And the other thing that also, that a lot of these movements, a lot of these Gnostic movements, and also the Manichees, until you were pure, you could do anything. You could live the life of Hugh Hefner.
There is no moral.
You could be Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes.
That was fine. And then once you became a sage, a wise man at the age of 75, and you could give up your sexual excesses, your drunkenness, your lechery, and now I'm perfect. And by the way, it explains why so many early Christians didn't want to be baptized until late in life, like the Emperor Constantine, because then they could get away with everything until the end.
This, in the end, at least, it shows a sense among these Christians that they needed sacraments to be to get the grace of God, to get holy, to arrive in heaven in the end.
Yes.
So there is a sense, but Christianity is all about salvation by the sacraments.
That's right.
While Gnosticism and esotericism and the Hermetic philosophy, they all preach one dogma, I think, and that is self-salvation by knowledge.
That's right. Knowledge, and which is always magical knowledge. I like to, when I run into these people... I
hear the phrase all the time, old, ancient, holy knowledge.
Yes, that's right. When I meet these people today, and Europe has many of them, and we have some in America, especially in some of these postmodern neo-pagan movements, and they boast about their sexual exploits and tricking women and doing this, but it always comes down to the little child who comes into a room and says, "I know something you don't know." And it gives them this great smug sense of satisfaction. Whereas for both ancient, for example, Socrates said, if I'm wiser than other men, it's only because I know how little I know. And that is also the basis of Christian wisdom. It's humility. There is no humility among the Gnostics. They don't want humility. They want the right to be better than everybody else. And it's just the old Adam finding new ways of exploiting. Even good ideas can be twisted and turned to evil.
Yeah, still the esoteric movements, you hear a lot of them saying that they don't know anything and that everything should be interesting and that we should be open-minded to everything and that ancient or holy knowledge it has always been hidden from us or for us. How do you say it in English? From us?
From us.
Yes. And the same thing you describe when you in your chapter on feminism, the same thing you notice about feminists. They always say that there is a truth, there is a knowledge, or there was a history that has been hidden from us by the church. Every time,
right.
time and time again, it's the
Patriarchal
church.
males
Yes.
have seized power, and of course, one of the great founding documents is Marx and Engels. Well, especially Engels put his name on it on the origin of the family property and the state. That once upon a time, savage patriarchal men seized power, and they created private property, they created government, and they created the family as a way of exploiting women, children, and everybody else. And the fact that there's absolutely no evidence, and in fact there's all the counter evidence in the world doesn't bother them. And what I found in studying sexual differences for this book, a lot of the greatest research had been done by feminists who wanted to prove this, but they were honest. And so they ended up proving, but these people who did studies of the endocrine systems, brain formation, they found time after time after time that in fact everything they believed was wrong. And they gave me some of my best evidence.
How did they stay still a feminist?
Well, I knew some very prominent feminist historians like Elizabeth Fox Genovese in America and others, and most of them died as serious Christians. That is, they were made of good character. They had been misled, and it took a long while, but they gradually worked their way toward the truth.
Okay.
You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
When they want to find the truth, they will find it. The same thing you hear about a lot of Enlightenment philosophers, that in the end they needed a priest to die.
Yes.
Before they died. I don't know if it's reliable information, but there are a lot of stories about Voltaire, Rousseau, yes, and a lot of D'Alembert.
Yes.
Who all of them died having a priest on their request. They didn't want to die as a enlightened person.
It didn't. It gave them freedom to be abusive in life, but then they had to look to the consequences. It's said, if I'm recalling correctly, André Gide, who lived his life as a moral degenerate, and he said that in old age, he said, if when I'm dying, I call for a priest, do not listen, because it will no longer be me. Because he had to identify himself as the enemy.
He knew his weakness.
Yes.
Okay. And did he die with a priest?
No. I had a very interesting experience. I had a friend who was a fairly prominent journalist in America, and he was my Washington Affairs editor, Samuel T. Francis. And Sam was a mild neo-pagan, and he had been brought up Christian. But I remember when he told me, he said, I've lost my faith. And I said, Sam, if you had faith, you haven't lost it. You have got lost, but your faith is there. So on his deathbed, his pagan friends put guards in the hospital so that no clergyman could come and rescue poor Sam. So I heard about this, and I had an assistant working for me, a great guy. He's now running an organization called Catholic Answers.
Yeah, I know him.
And Christopher Check, his brother was a priest. And so his brother called somebody that we all knew, Father Paul Scalia, who is the son of Antonin Scalia, the famous conservative on the Supreme Court. And Father Paul Scalia goes to the hospital, and he said it was like the Acts of the Apostles, where Peter, all of a sudden the guards are gone, there's nobody there. And so he walked in and he said, Dr. Francis, my name is Father Paul Scalia. I believe you respect my father. And Sam Francis can't speak, but he said, yeah. He said, I've come to offer you the last rites of the Catholic Church. Would you like it? And he said, this won't make you a Catholic. I know you were brought up Presbyterian, but you'll die with everything. You'll die a Christian. And his pagan friends to this day say this never happened. It's amazing. They can't admit the fact. I knew Sam Francis' family later, and I met the people he grew up with. They were a very fine Christian family, and that kind of upbringing, it stuck, and it's why he was always a morally responsible person. My father was an ex-Catholic atheist, but he always behaved as the priests and nuns had taught him to behave. He was completely honorable, and of course, my mother dragged him back to the church late in life.
Well, from the church back to nature, I would say. It is a remarkable testimony, by the way. But it all went from Plato versus Aristotle to this beautiful testimony. But Aristotle wasn't a Christian. Plato wasn't.
No.
Why was Aristotle so... His thought, his way, his philosophy, why was it so, do you say usable for the Christian mind in the Middle Ages?
Well, if you look at the very beginning of the church, you look in the generation after the apostles and their immediate students, heresies were springing up. There was a Judaizing heresy. Everybody has to get practice all the kosher laws, get circumcised. There was the heresies which said that we're morally free. We don't have to obey any moral law because under Christ we're free. We can do anything, and these arguments could not be met simply by citing Scripture. And immediately, Justin Martyr, and then Clement of Alexandria, Origen, all of these, especially the Eastern Fathers, they were very good and the Cappadocian Fathers later, they were very good at taking the arguments of Plato and Aristotle and showing and exposing all the fallacies in these various heresies that were coming up. And so the teachings of Plato and Aristotle in particular, and to some extent the moral philosophy of the Stoics, became an essential part of the developing Christian tradition. I have many good Protestant friends who think that, well, we should go back to the days of the Church of the Apostles. Well, there are two problems with that. First of all we have is the Acts of the Apostles to go by. That's not much. And even in the Acts of the Apostles, they try primitive communism and it doesn't work. So they made mistakes like everybody else.
Well, they cut out the context in which the Bible came to existence anyway.
That's right.
The Bible was made to use in the Holy Mass.
That's right.
Not for another purpose.
No. You know, Augustine says, I think maybe it's in the De Doctrina Christiana, but he says that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. The Bible, the Scriptures, are the way. But you could have the truth and the life without ever reading the Bible. Simply accept what the Church teaches you, and you shouldn't get simply trapped in the Bible. Of course, is a magnificent and a work that should be studied and constantly studied, and especially through liturgical services. But it is not an object of worship,
Do Protestants worship the Bible?
I think just as there are Catholics who worship the Pope, there are Protestants who worship the Bible. It's a mistake in both cases.
Okay. Why shouldn't you worship the Bible as the Word of God?
Because
it's the revelation of God Himself.
Of course, it is to be revered, but not to be. And of course, they will. In the Jewish tradition, which I respect a great deal, but they have. I was told by a rabbi once who was a mathematician, when I was a college student, I was studying the book of Job in the Greek version, and the rabbi said that when he was a student, that if you mispronounced a sacred word of Scripture, you were beaten. And of course, you can't pronounce the name of God because it's a sacred name. There is this magical element to it of actual worship, of a reverence that goes beyond reverence to worshiping the words themselves. And this can be dangerous because everybody can then decide what those words mean, and he creates a God in his own image and recreates the Scriptures according to his own way of thinking, and that becomes quite dangerous.
Where does our knowledge come from that makes us man? Plato and Aristotle had a view on the human soul, on human nature.
They certainly did, but it also derives a lot from the common Greek experience. You know, Plato makes fun of the poets and the earlier philosophers, but in fact they were very important for his way of thinking. Aristotle does not make fun of them. He assumes that the things that ordinary people have accepted by then, 1,000 years of Greek cultural tradition, that there's a basis of truth in them. The problem is simple people don't know why it's true, why a man should tell the truth, why he should get married, why you should revere your parents and take care of their burial. All of these things were Aristotle accepts, and that explains why you should do it. He also says that if you young men shouldn't start rushing into studying philosophy, because if they have a bad character, then they'll just simply find justification for their bad character, which seems to me the history of philosophy since the Enlightenment, finding an excuse for why you are the way you are.
Yeah, so again, the point that modern philosophy is about justifying our failures.
Yes.
Failure in character, in morals.
I used to know some very famous libertarians, and when I told one of them that a Catholic friend of mine was now calling himself a libertarian, his response was, well, is he cheating on his taxes or molesting children? And I said, what are you saying? He said, well, in my experience, people become libertarian to justify something dishonorable.
Yeah.
It's cruel, and it's not entirely true, but it's true in a broad way of most modern forms of philosophy, and especially in this postmodern world where you find a reason why you have a right to commit every abomination under the sun.
So their hatred for altruism comes from their own egoism?
Yes.
And they actually worship their own ego again. So the libertarians wants to do everything that is in their own benefit and justify it.
Yes. And of course, many of them are decent people with they've just been misled like feminists, and so the best libertarian I knew, Murray Rothbard, who was he was married to a Christian. He was an atheist. He was a Jewish atheist. But he always spoke with respect of Christianity, because he said people who practice Christianity are better than people who don't. That is, they lead better lives. He could observe this. And the older he got, the more he became ethically very conservative. And a lot of Rothbardians who they confuse him with Ayn Rand and all of this other stuff. And in fact, he was a very decent and kind person.
Please excuse me for briefly interrupting this conversation in Pisa with this great philosopher. We'll continue in a moment. For more information about the Triad project and the accompanying series of conversation, I recommend reading my book, The Triads. It just appeared in print in English. The project is still in development and will ultimately consist of 4 books. Of course, I encourage you very much to read Mr. Fleming's groundbreaking and now classic book, The Politics of Human Nature, which is still in print and available worldwide. Dutch readers can read this conversation in the Dutch magazine Epoque, which has now been printed and sent to all subscribers. It is the issue number 25. Please order these titles, as that will enable me to continue this series. You can find them all on the bluetiger.studio website. The link is also in the description below this video. Please help us. I'd also like to ask you to share this conversation as widely as possible. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, like this video and share it with your friends. I'm very grateful for that, and I'll do my best to bring truly unique content in the upcoming episodes and to highlight ideas that aren't the result of predetermined formulas. Thinking is work, after all. It is the result of friction, apparent contradictions, and above all, the humility that comes from realizing we think and say little that is new, but time and again discover that we are making our own what already exists and what has already been said or thought. Enjoy the rest of this conversation.
I grew up in South Carolina, where in Charleston, which is a very hot, sunny climate, and I learned to appreciate shade. Deprived of sunlight, people become strange. There's a reason why there's such weird things in Nordic religion,
yes.
Because they get very moody and depressed.
Yes.
And the lack of sunlight, and we now have neurological studies that show the lack of melatonin and things will cause high rates of suicide.
Yeah, that's true. And very individualistic people tend to live solo, much more in the north than in the south.
Yeah.
It's widely known that Italians love to be together. In Spain the same. Portugal the same. Divorce rates are high in the south. Yeah. Strangely enough. I don't know.
Except lower in Sicily than in the rest of Italy.
Okay.
It's very funny. I read a book about 10 years ago. It was an academic monograph on studying the development of Italian. Was Italy really becoming more unified? And the conclusion was no, actually, southern Italy was remaining Catholic and family-centered and community-centered. And the farther north you went, if you looked Milano and Torino, that they were becoming, they didn't go to church, although in rural Lombardia that's not true, but that really Italy is splitting more so than 50 years ago.
And where is the borderline?
South of Rome.
Well, let's mention a couple of other remarkable things you say in the politics of human nature. So it's all about kin. That your later works are already actually in this book, I think.
Yes.
So I don't see any real. Maybe I misread your last work, but I don't see any real new arguments in your later work. It's all working out arguments from your politics of human nature.
It's intended to be that way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
This was intended to be the natural foundation.
Yes.
And then take up the next book, the Morality of Everyday Life, was started as a preface, actually, to what I wanted to write later on, and that is, I thought I had to eliminate completely the authenticity of the liberal tradition, both in its original sense, but also in its then Marxist sense, that you had to just simply destroy the underpinnings of it and then go on into what I've been doing now, looking at actually historical forms of kinship and community.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So community is a very important, it's not the family. Do you see the family as the nuclear family or a broader entity?
It's both, because like the German Protestant, Johannes Althaus, Althusius. Althusius begins with he calls it he has this abstract language. He calls it the organic dyad, but that's exactly Aristotle. But even Plato uses the example of the Cyclopes in Homer, who, as Homer says, each man gave the law to his wife and children, and that it was a patriarchal society. And so both Plato and Aristotle realized something which a lot of anthropologists realize is, and of course Cicero, who quotes an earlier philosopher, said the family is the seedbed of the community. But of course the Greeks and Romans had different views, but essentially the family was all the descendants that could trace their descent from a single ancestor. And so Greek inheritance laws are very interesting to look at. Inheritance laws in general are a way of seeing how do people see society. So for example, for a Greek, your eldest son inherited, the property was split among the sons, but the eldest had to take care of the burial and the grave of his and the annual ceremony for his dead father. But if you had no other son, then it was a nephew, and you could see this branching effect. In our society, like in America, you could say in many states you could say I'm going to give nothing to my wife and children and everything to a girl I met last week at a nightclub. And there was a famous case in Texas, just about 25 years ago, where a man had abandoned his family, and he gave it all to a Playboy bunny named Anna Nicole Smith. And this was front page all over the world. Now, because Texas is still a place of sanity, he could only give away half his estate. He was still bound. But in decent societies, you can't disinherit your family, but the inheritance laws are a key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's go further back. You make a good argument for the community and for marriage and for the idea that in the beginning there was not such a thing as a wild man living in on his own.
No.
There was actually you say the tribe or the kinship or the blood relation was the basis all the time from the beginning for human life.
That's right.
And so one of the nice things of what you wrote is that, well, socialists or modern philosophy, they thought that kinship doesn't matter, or didn't matter, and that they wanted to replace it with individualism. But in the end, they wanted to have an alternative community, the commune.
Yes.
And that failed miserably.
Always.
Yeah, all of them.
Yes.
So, but there is in those modern leftist, progressive, idealistic philosophers, they keep on dreaming of a new man.
That's right.
Why is it?
Well, once you strip man of everything, once you strip him of his attachment to his parents, to his wife, to his children, to his neighbors, to his kinsmen, then he has to create a new society. He's like a science fiction writer creating the universe. I think I don't know if I quote it, but the man who created the Star Trek program on television, it's a silly program, but some people complained there were inconsistencies, and he said, look, God took 6 days to create the universe. I had a weekend to create my universe. But see, that is the position of every great political theorist. He has to reinvent the world. You see, with us, with a Christian tradition, or with somebody classically trained, or somebody with his roots in the Middle Ages, he doesn't have to make up the world. The world exists, and all of these things that are so important, we accept them. But if you obliterate it all, then you have to sit down and think, well, what if man walked on his hands instead of on his feet? Why not?
It must have been that way in the beginning. Yeah. And another fallacy of you that you bring to the surface is that modern philosophy, evolutionists, Darwinists, they assume that that there was a primitive stage of humanity, and in this primitive stage we believed in magic.
Yes.
But at the same time, they don't find any animal that is believing in magic. So there is no other species on Earth that has a magic faith system.
That's right.
Anyhow, so that points to humanity in a way that it is already very, how do you say, exempt?
Yes, very, very unique.
Unique.
You know,
yeah.
All of the speculators who have talked about like development of human society, they will look at early settlements in the Middle East, in Turkey and in Mesopotamia, and they will say, you see, they had surplus food, and so then they could do other things, and then they had crossroads, and at those trade crossroads, they built cities, and that's how human development. Actually, what we now know is that everywhere in the world where it can be studied, including even North America, among North American Indians, they got together into larger communities for worship purposes. That worship is the center of the human community.
Yeah. So in worship, those even in pagan remote societies like Indians, where they worship the sun or the moon or whatever, there is still a sense of a supreme God.
That's right.
Which is not bound to a planet or a sun or a star or whatever. Why did those primitive religions anyway start worshipping planets, stars, whatever?
Yes, it's well, because they were represented something beyond their senses, something that were powerful, something that was essential to their life. So the sea, the sun. It's interesting. The Greeks were very different from the Egyptians and to some extent and to some of the Middle Eastern cults, in that we read a book of mythology. We say Apollo is the god of the sun. No, he had nothing to do with the sun. He was Apollo. He was a divine being, and he was radiant. He presided over music and poetry, and he had all these attributes. But Helios was the sun, but they didn't worship him. There are a few places in the Greek world where they might worship the sun or the moon. They had names for them, but Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, they have areas of activity, but they were not natural phenomena, and they never were.
They were superior to the domain they were bound to.
That's right.
Okay.
But they were not. But the people talk about the great religious revolution in Egypt, where Akhenaten, he was a monotheist. He worshipped the sun. At least the older Egyptians had worshipped a god associated with the sun. He actually worshipped the sun. He said the sun, the disk of the sun, is the only true God, and his representative on earth is, guess who? Me, the Pharaoh. I am God on earth.
Okay.
It's amazing how religious revolutions like this, how often that's what it really means. I look at the sun, I am the sun, and I am his word on earth. And you get this with all these false prophets who come up, and these gurus who are constantly cropping up in American history. Because all of a sudden the word of God is incarnate in them.
Yes. So okay. Is that those are the dots that are connecting sectarianism and esotericism? The Belgian historian Henri Pirenne.
Oh yes, of course.
He wrote that at a certain moment in the Byzantine era, the sects were fighting for the favor of the emperor, which makes them more powerful. But in the end, sects fighting each other, or religious or esoteric movements, in a way, modern atheistic philosophers can say, well, yes, but the Catholic Church was only one of them, and in the end, it grew out as the biggest, most powerful one. It was the original sin of Christianity was to get to world power.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, the Christian church is full of human beings, and as human beings, we're constantly twisting. But it is one of the amazing things about both the Catholic Church and the Eastern Church is how they survive these crises. We're going through a crisis in the Catholic Church right now, perhaps more serious than the Orthodox. And yet, in the later Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, a pope like the Medici Pope, Leo X, was a terrible human being. When he was chosen, when the Medici got their boy into the Vatican, some of the cardinals wrote, well, at least we've got a pope now who's not chasing women. Well, there's a reason he wasn't chasing women. And yet, somehow, by the Renaissance papacy faded away. It became much better. In the one of the worst crises of the church was the French Revolution. Pius VI was captured by French Jacobin soldiers, and he was so abused, he died in captivity. And his successor was ridiculed and bullied by Napoleon. And yet, out of all this mess emerges a papacy under Pius IX and his successor, Leo. And it's amazing how successful these churches have been, despite so often falling into the hands of con artists and scoundrels.
Yeah, which happened a lot to other sects.
Yes, it happened. Well, look at what happened when there was because of the First Vatican Council, when the Germans decided to rebel. Some German bishops decided to rebel and call themselves the Old Catholics because they were holding on to. Now they have women clergy. There are very few of them, but there are no rule. All the rules are off because they were free to reinvent things in their own image. By the way, to go back to the sense of marriage and community, the best atheist philosopher produced by the Enlightenment was David Hume. And David Hume was a careful observer of human life. And he once observed, man born of woman is compelled to sustain society. In other words, we cannot escape from the fact that we live within a community of attachment because we're born We're born helpless and feeble and dependent 100% upon our mother, and then upon mother and father, and then upon mother, father, kinsmen, neighbors. It's a natural evolution until finally one day you can wake up and say, I think I'm an individual. You're probably deceiving yourself.
Yeah. Is it an evolution, or has it always been that way?
It's always been that. I mean, it's within a human life, it's an evolution.
Yes.
The Stoics talked about something they call oikoiosis, which means appropriation. You know, a baby is oriented solely toward its mother, then it's toward the family, then toward the community, and eventually a Stoic genius might say, I love all mankind. I'm a citizen of the world. But unfortunately, what people want to be, they want to begin as citizens of the world and say, therefore, like the Buddha, walk away from your family, your responsibility, and that way always leads to disaster.
So we have a long history of only modern philosophy. We discussed esoteric movements and sectarians from the Manichaeans in the ancient times, and the Egyptians and the actually somehow postmodern Romans and Greek. But this modern philosophies, they always claimed to rebuild man to a new image, that they become God on their own, maybe. So we have the most recent movement is actually feminism, I think, that to rebuild men and women to a new image. But then there is always a goal in the future they want to achieve. And now we live in the era of the genetic codes, the DNA. We discovered the DNA about 30 years ago. Until now, people are still discovering things in our DNA. And those modern people keep on saying, well, yeah, but if we can change man, if we can change its DNA, then we can build up a new humanity. In the end, there will be a moment we will set free from our old traditional, backward, retard laws of human nature.
Yes, that's right. You know, C.S. Lewis was dealing with some of that in the 1940s when behaviorism was coming along, and they were just beginning to talk about scientific. They didn't know, of course, Watson and Crick had not discovered DNA, but they had learned something about genetics and the neo-Darwinist synthesis. And so scientists and behavioral psychologists were talking about liberating mankind from these shackles. And that's what inspired Lewis to write his book, The Abolition of Man.
Yeah.
Because the ultimate will be that it will be a re-engineered human race that will be without any real human attributes. One of the things I find amazing is that the people who have best dealt with this question have been fiction writers and dramatists. Karl Čapek, the Czech, for example, wrote a book called, a play called R.U.R., in which androids take over the world.
But that's what they want. They want to make us machines.
Yes, of course. And Čapek, by the way, was a good Catholic and a friend of G.K. Chesterton. But he also wrote a book called The War with the Newts. But time after time after time, it has been fiction writers like Jean Ionesco in the Rhinoceros. Again, Ionesco had gradually worked his way back to when I met him in about 1985, he was now struggling, trying to return back to his religious roots, at which he did. And his last few writings are as a Christian. But in the Rhinoceros, you see everybody around you turning into an inhuman beast. Now, it was at the time people said, well, he's criticizing Stalinism. Stalinism, Marxism is only one example, because rampant consumer capitalism is destroying the soul of man in the same way that Marxism is destroying the soul of man, and feminists are destroying the role of man. And that's the failure of conservatism, so-called, in America and Britain, is because conservatism is just one more revolutionary anti-human movement.
How convincing is the idea that we have a soul?
It is obviously not convincing to a great many people today. I think a lot of it, I've been wrestling with this problem recently. Is what when you read in the scripture, what when they talk about soul, and the word is very ambiguous because it means life as well. It's the breath of life, and what Christ is promising us is that soul, not that soul is inherently necessarily immortal, such as Plato believed, but rather that Christ has promised us an eternal life of the soul in a different kind of existence. But when the soul becomes, among philosophic treatments, it becomes something sort of abstract, and it's so difficult to define that it's sort of a will o' the wisp. It flickers out, and we don't know what it is. For the ancient world, they knew that every living thing had some kind of soul, whether a vegetable soul or an animal soul or a rational soul, but they knew it was inherent in life, and it's what holds life together. And the trouble today is, I think most philosophy is purely academic. People write these papers simply to get promotion, and they talk only to each other. They never talked. I once attended a meeting among Marxist philosophers and political theorists, and they talked about rebuilding community, and it was all little cooperative stores and things. And I said, they all came from New York. And I said, you've never actually lived in America where if they have community, it's because they go to church. That's the only expression of community left in the United States. But similarly, the soul has to be recognized as what the human soul, our specific sort of soul, is what distinguishes us from our closest cousins. Because in many respects, everyday life in New York City is a lot less pleasant than life among chimpanzees and baboons. And because these are people who act as if they have no soul.
That's amazing. And do chimpanzees have a soul?
They have an animal soul. They have life.
Yes.
And so to that extent...
That's your Aristotelian perspective coming up again, which is very interesting because Aristotle thought that the soul has 3 layers.
Yes.
A vegetative layer,
yes.
which we share with plants and
That's
trees.
Right.
The will to survive and the will to procreate, and that we have an animal soul,
Yes.
which has senses.
Yes.
And then we have a human soul. What makes it special?
I think for Aristotle, it would be the capacity for reasoning and making moral choices. And animals can make choices to a certain extent. They can choose A or B, but they don't make choices based on some standard of goodness, that their mind perceives. They do what they have to do.
Is there not a biological research that shows that chimpanzees have a kind of very low or a rudimentary form of moral choices?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Because there are all sorts of good work has been done. Some of it, Frans de Waal, who was working at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. They have a large chimpanzee lab there, and he did a lot on moral and political behavior of chimpanzees. Shows how they make alliances, how women withhold sexual favors if their mate has abused them. I mean, it's very endearing portrait, and how they can hold on to revenge. They can, like, if you do something bad to a fellow chimp in your tribe, and he'll hold on to it for a couple of days, and when you're not looking, he'll get even with you. But so many of a lot of our less amiable human characteristics are within the primate family. But you can because we're not angels. And this is one of the fundamental mistakes made by most modern philosophy, that they think we're capable of living as angels, of rising above all circumstance, all material. Our bodies don't really count except as organs from which we can divide pleasure, but they impose no limitation on us. So sex differences impose no limitation.
Yeah.
I can freely choose to become a man, or now you have people who dress up in like stuffed animals, and they hold meetings in hotels, and they have sex orgies among people dressed up like dogs and cats and stuffy bears and things. I mean, but again, this is what happens when you say everything is in the mind, nothing else exists.
Yeah, but what's then the clear distinction between animals and man?
It has to be that man is capable of doing things which he are not necessarily in his best interest, but which he perceives as the correct thing to do, whether it's something he has thought out rationally or something he has accepted from, there are no chimpanzee martyrs.
No.
Where people talk a lot about altruism in lower animals. Actually, altruism can be explained very simply by sociobiological calculus. If I am a chimpanzee and I have 4 children, if I sacrifice my life to save those 4 children, they have twice my genetic material as I do, so my genes benefit. That makes perfect sense. But with human martyrs, not just Christian martyrs, but martyrs to principle, to decency, people who sacrifice themselves in a war for the sake of their community, it cannot. There may be a template way down deep that is sociobiological, but they've gone way beyond that, and it is non-self-seeking.
But then your pagan friends or atheist friends would say the same, that, well, that's quite stupid and retard to do, to die for a religion or a conviction.
Yes.
You have to choose for yourself.
Yes. Well, the trouble is their choices are dictated by the sort of school they went to and what their third grade teacher taught them, or what they learned in some introduction to philosophy course in a junior college. It's how very few of the neo-pagan atheists I've met, very few of them know anything. I used to correspond with Richard Dawkins, who was one of the most famous living atheists. I was interested in his research when I was working on this book, and Dawkins runs around lecturing on what's wrong with Christianity, but he has never actually read anything. He simply reads other atheist treatises about how crazy Christians are, and did you know that Thomas Aquinas flies around the Notre Dame Cathedral? And
Really?
He'll ask this of some Christian theologian, or especially he'll ask it of a Calvinist theologian. The Calvinist say, I don't know what you're talking about. But I find that in these big debates that they've had between, say, fundamentalist Christians on the one hand and atheists on the other, the atheists know nothing about Christianity and the fundamentalists know nothing about biology. And so they can't talk to each other.
So that was one of the purposes of your book?
Yes.
To combine it?
Yes, exactly. To show, and I think in everything I've done since, I've tried to show that Christianity has been mischaracterized completely as a false religion that teaches you that to ignore all material necessity. War is always wrong. Capital punishment is wrong. We must divide our resources. None of that is true. None of that is true in the teachings of Jesus himself. It's not true in the teachings of the apostles. It's not true in how Christians have conducted themselves throughout. It's an easy straw man to say, oh, look, these people are ridiculous, and then you can just dismiss it all. Or you could say, if you were a real Christian, you'd be a Marxist feminist like me.
Yes, somehow in your books, also in your latest book, you more or less say that, or argue that the artificial hierarchy of the state and even maybe in the church today is in a deep crisis, and that there is a kind of basic human connectivity like kinship.
Yes.
We should return to. Now my question is kinship a better form of connectedness between people than the church or the state or the nation or whatever? And keep in mind that Jesus told that he came to divide families, that he set up the son against his father and the daughter against his mother, that there is a kind of tension between a community based on kinship and blood instead of religion or nationality or whatever modern things are connecting us.
Yes. Well, a lot of what Jesus says is he's trying to explain to his disciples that they in particular, for example, have a very specific role that they're going to have to do, and they're going to have to face persecution, and they have to make up their mind, and that if their family tries to stop them, they have to choose life and Christ above all else. It's also the most intimate portrait of Jesus we have in the Gospels. Is the one Gospel written by somebody who knew him personally is the Gospel of John. And John's first miracle is the wedding at Cana. Now, why didn't Jesus say when they said, well, we're run out of wine? Well, what does that have to do with me? I'm opposed to marriage. I don't want you to have children. I don't want normal life to go on. No. He turns the water, the ritual of the ritual bath, because the water came from these things for the Jewish ritual bath. He turns the Jewish ritual bath water into the wine of life, and thereby endorses marriage, community, and everything that grows out of that. Wider kinship networks are the way the household integrates with the rest of society. And the broader, like my second cousins, I don't know very well, but I mean, in a coherent society, you know everybody. Like in medieval Pisa here, kinship counted for everything, and they had very little government. But if you do away with this, if you do away with all these intermediaries, and also, by the way, at the same time, whittle away the power of the church, because now you have a right to go to church in modern Europe and the United States. But can the church stand up and say we're going to enforce laws on sodomy, laws on divorce, laws on adultery, laws on incest? Even incest laws are failing. Germany is discussing possible laws on permission for uncle-niece marriage. In the United States, they're discussing brother-sister marriage as long as they're over 21. And the church is forbidden to, and the church you could have leftist church leaders complain about putting to death a serial killer who's been murdering children. And that's terrible. But on the other hand, he can't talk about divorce, can't talk about infanticide, can't talk about anything else. So as long as you had, on the one hand, powerful kinship networks, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you had the power of the church, then the government, the state, the king, the emperor, was not everything. He had very little power. The Holy Roman Emperor, in theory, had power over Pisa until Friedrich II,
but not in reality,
gave them a charter of liberty. But their power was limited. Today, in theory, the government of the United States can say, I can marry my dog. If it wants to make that law next week, in the name of democracy and majority rule, you can reinvent the human species, which we've been doing. But as long as there were these forces acting together to prevent this vast takeover, I find North Americans are particularly susceptible. I'm an individual, I'm independent, and these are people who don't have an independent thought in their mind. Everything they know is what they see on television or on the internet, and yet they're proud of being a great individual. and yet they're completely slaves of the government.
So instead of universalism, we turn into uniformity.
Exactly. We are alas, we're like Chopek's androids. We are like, there was a very fine movie I talk about a lot to people. It was made in the 1950s called The Invasion of the Body Snatchers by Donald Siegel, and based on a cheap science fiction novel. But the fact is, what they were talking about in the movie is man becoming inhuman. And so in this case, I'm so happy now that I've changed. I don't care about anybody else. I just leave my life. And you could watch, and the last humans are discovered because they're walking across the street and a car almost runs over a small child and they scream. They have human compassion. That they have to be eliminated. And what was a terrifying movie when I was 13 years old and saw it is now everyday reality.
Yeah.
Man has pagans had some degree of compassion. Christians had much more. And so during plague time, in the ancient world and in the medieval world, Christians would even work to help dying pagans, not just members of their own family and fellow Christians. And this was a great asset in the end because people said, well, if being a Christian means you're willing to do that, then these must be very good people. And then maybe I should look into this. Today, compassion, except in the form of organized compassion, let's spend a lot of money importing illegal aliens, and if they commit crimes, that's too bad because it's all our fault. But no everyday compassion. People don't know their neighbors. They move constantly. They don't know who. The first time I met somebody, I asked him what his background was. He says, I don't know. My family came from Europe somewhere. I said, what about your grandparents? I don't know my grandparents.
Whoa.
I didn't grow up in such a world.
No, me neither. Yeah. Now, pagans could say, well, we don't want back to Christian Europe, Christian Western civilization, because it was strict, retard, it was full of social laws and family laws, and come on, Tom, you know that there are gays, there are this, and there is, and there are that, and you know that men are not monogamous. Come on, but of course we will fight together against that fourth industrial revolution. We will fight together again. We don't want to become machines, and so the two opposites we talked about, they always seem to find not so comfortable with a completely free individual they have in mind. The neo-pagan man who wants to spread its seed everywhere, who wants to be free to do whatever he wants. But he doesn't also want to go back to Christian Europe, to an era in which family and church work together against the state, against abuse of power, against whatever kind of abuse we have from human human nature. Mm-hmm. What would you say to it?
I'd ask them to look back 100 years, or 500 years rather. Look back even to those who have some family memory, to your grandparents' age. People of my parents' age, they never locked the door in their house.
Yeah.
When I lived in a small village in South Carolina for a while in the 1970s and early 80s, we would leave the key in the car on the seat. Nobody's going to steal our car. We didn't have locks on the windows. I asked a friend who had been grown up in this little town, and I said, well, what do you do when you go away? He said, well, we leave the door open because what if a neighbor needed something? Now, when I was in college...
I know even stories that people didn't lock their the bathroom.
Yes.
It wasn't an issue of privacy.
No.
It didn't came up in their minds.
No. The violence against women, for example. I was once teaching a Latin course in Charleston, at the College of Charleston. The students wanted to know about women in the ancient world, and I was describing to them, and I said, when I was a student here, 15 years ago, there was no problem with women being molested. Now, there is now rape on campus. This has become a kind of national sport now. It's a collegiate sport to abuse women, and or let aliens onto the campus and let them do it. And so an older woman in her 50s, and extremely unattractive, said, "Well, I suppose that's just the sacrifice we have to make." And I said, "Excuse me, madam, but that's not the sacrifice you have to make. You're asking these young ladies here to make that sacrifice. The world has become a very dangerous, ugly, unpleasant place. People, that's why they sit at home so much. And when they do go out, when they go out to nightclubs, and all the incredible amount of violence, drug use, suicide, the constant abuse of women and young women and children, these are things, that just went on, you didn't know. No, you did know. That's the whole point. If you live in a community, everybody knows what everybody else is doing all the time. There's no way to hide.
Would immediately reveal any abuse.
That's right. Okay. That's right. And so which world do you want? Do you want a world where you can walk, where my wife, she grew up, her father was a Air Force officer during World War II. And so after the war, he was sent back to be a base commander in England. And at the age of 12, she could get on a train and go into London and spend the day with her friends, looking at music. Could you imagine a 12-year-old girl on the loose? And friends of mine in New York, they would say the same thing. You could walk all over New York City in the 1940s and 50s, and Chicago, everywhere. There's now. Cities of 50 to 100,000 aren't safe after dark. And so you have to look objectively at the world the way it was. And if you can go back far enough, you go back to, say, 1900 or 1880, look at the safety, the decency, the charity that existed. Or
but it's remarkably.
If you really want to go crazy, come here and look at the cathedral. What atheist built anything like what we have cities that are hideously ugly with modern theoretical architecture that's an eyesore, and is built like a Nazi concentration camp. And if that's the world you want, then say that's the world I endorse. Otherwise, take a good hard look, and people of decent intelligence should be able to say, well, it's going to be my job the rest of my life to figure out where the world started going really wrong, because it's been getting worse every 20, 30 years for as long as I've been alive and throughout my parents' lifetime. Certain things are easier. Because you have a welfare state that takes care of you but unfortunately it also enslaves, hundreds of millions of people around the globe who are forced to live under those conditions. So just ask yourself, which world do you want?
Yep. And it will be either of both sides. There is no middle.
Yeah, that's right.
Because every middle you choose will inevitably again go to the dystopian world we live in.
That's right.
So your credo from the beginning, go back to the origins.
That's right.
What the Greeks wanted to do every time, what was the beginning of every survey and research and philosophy, is the same. It's the same for you also in this matter.
Yes, indeed. And if you go to take something very trivial, like the decline of the English language, for example, which has been the New York Times 30 or 40 years ago it wasn't a very good newspaper, but it was intelligibly written. It was clear, coherent English. A couple of the columnists had a good prose style. Now it's written by children scrawling on their computers. It's unreadable. The English language has completely collapsed. People with PhDs, a PhD in science can't talk to a PhD in French. They have nothing in common. Basic forms of logic and reasoning have disappeared. And you can trace this decline for example, in the United States, with the disappearance of the classical curriculum, which started right after World War I, excuse me. And you could, every generation that people have given up to systematic study and discipline, except for science. The scientists have a good discipline because they have to study math, and so they're not stupid. But people who just study history or English or whatever, they have become completely alienated from tradition, and the result is our language has disappeared, standards of decency and dress have disappeared, public behavior, people do unspeakable things on the street now in every major city in the world. And I'm not saying go back and teach Latin and everything is going to be better. What I'm saying is go back to when things still worked.
Yeah.
You can't repeat the past, but you can learn from how things worked, how to do it again, how to reform the educational process, how you homeschool as I did, and it's right now it's about the only alternative there is.
Okay. So is there a way back for the West? Is there a way to just reform the whole stuff and tomorrow we go to a family-loving, community-loving, new or actually very old civilization?
Yes. Well, the trouble with counter-revolutionary movements is, first of all, they never work. They're usually based on nostalgia. You know, why can't we go back to the way we were when I was a kid?
Yeah.
And they're usually, the projects are usually naive, even when it's something so simple as restoring the Bourbon monarchy in France after the Revolution, or restoring the Stuarts after the English Civil War. I think it was Burke who said, rage and frenzy can tear down in a matter of hours what it has taken centuries to construct. And we've had rage and frenzy going on, at least in a very highly accelerated way throughout the past 150 years. And the roots of it go much farther back. We've destroyed the foundations of society. And it's going to take more than goodwill or a political movement. In America, of course, in 1980, everybody told me that when we elected Ronald Reagan, everything was going to be different. And the commercials said, it's morning again in America. You know, the birds are singing. And now with Donald Trump, it's morning again. And it's a terrible delusion, and it's a temptation to the first person who comes along who says, I represent family values, tradition, etc. And if you follow me, we'll go and blow up buildings, or we'll win an election, or we'll do whatever's necessary. And it's not going to work that way. What usually happens in a society such as North America and Europe, it has to really fall apart much worse.
So collapse is inevitable.
Yeah. And you can see what in a broad sense, I've noted certain trends. Like, for example, there's been the centripetal trend of concentrating power in ever smaller, concentrated power over a vast amount of territory in fewer and fewer hands in one location. So, you know, the United States was originally 13 separate entities. They were called states because they were independent and they were in a confederal union. Now we have, and then they spread across the country. Now we have 30 million people ruled by a couple of thousand, you know, politicians, bureaucrats, and very wealthy people. It's as concentrated a power center as, say, Moscow in fact, far more concentrated. We're doing things in the United States that the Stalinists never dreamed of. I mean, Stalin didn't talk about you can change your gender if you want. Stalin didn't even directly make war on the nuclear family. He did make war, and he and Lenin both made war on the extended family, but they let the nuclear family alone because somebody's got to raise these kids before.
Yes, but in the Soviets, science was also a strong opposition to revolution. I recently read about lobotomy and the history of it.
Yeah.
The first anti-lobotomy scientists came from Soviet Russia in the 30s, 20s, 30s, so Stalin's time.
That's right.
Because they say, well, it's not proven that it will solve any problem. So it's splitting the hemispheres in the brain. And there is no known problem in which lobotomy is practiced that will not solve on its own. That will not be solved on its own. So lobotomy is a problem, is a solution for something that can solve itself. That was the stance of the Soviet scientists in that era, and I think that all the bad stories about what happened in the Soviet time, it happened a lot, but maybe it might be also overrated.
The very fact that they had opposition. You
Yes.
see, there was a real, and when Solzhenitsyn, Safarevich, and some of those people came along, they were arguing against, not just against Stalinism, not just against late Marxism. They were arguing against the fundamental foundations of the Soviet Union.
But apparently, in the West, there was no opposition to those lobotomy scientists in America,
nor
in
to anything
Sweden,
else,
in
nor to
England.
anything else. There is no, for example, the right-wing opposition in the United States is all over trivial things, and they change their mind every few years about what they're in favor. They used to be in favor of open immigration. I was constantly in trouble because I was saying a country can't be a country if it doesn't manage its immigration laws. But I remember the one time I was in Russia, I had dinner with Igor Shafarevich, the great mathematician and was one of the great dissidents. And I realized I was talking with an independent-minded person, a man who had a right to his own opinions and was deeply learned and a brilliant mathematician. We don't produce those people in America anymore. And there's also been, of course, this centripetal tendencies. You see over the past 50 years, constant breakaway movements. For example, the Vlaamsblok, now the Vlaamsbelang, and they never work, they never succeed. But the fact that there's Flemish nationalists in Belgium, I did a lot of reporting on the Lega Nord in northern Italy, and I got to know Umberto Bossi, the head of the party, and I knew Scots nationalists, Quebec nationalists. In the United States, I knew there were a lot of Southern people who wanted to bring back an independent South. And so these things go on, and none of them actually works, because people aren't willing. I once asked a group of Southern Americans, I said, well, here's a $5 bill. It has the picture of the hated Abraham Lincoln on it. How many people will stand up and set fire to that $5 bill? Not one. Not one. And the fact is, people, as long as people are comfortable, they will talk about how discontent they are. But in material terms, the average person in North America or Northern Europe is pretty comfortable. He doesn't have to sweat. He doesn't have to work hard. He's got a pension coming. And in your country, it's incredibly easy to get disability, and then you get a paid vacation because you have I read an interview with a Dutch lady. She said, "I just don't like being with people, and so you can't expect me to work, can you?" Well, as long as that goes on, you can afford it, and it will go on. But
it's
it's
the famous Gen Z.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My son runs he owns and is chef proprietor of a nice restaurant. He said finding young employees is very difficult.
Yeah.
All over Pisa, you see little signs saying pizza maker wanted, staff hiring at all levels of staff, because all over North America and Europe, especially since COVID, people learned you didn't have to work.
I know a lot of small family-owned businesses in Italy, Germany, etc.
Yeah.
And all of them complain that their next generation will not take over the factory or the workshop or the whatever they do, and they can make a fine living.
Yeah.
But no, they don't want to do it because it's a lot of work. They can earn a lot of money, they can extend the company, they can do whatever they like, but they prefer studying law and then go to a bank, work for a bank, or
Yeah.
it's hopeless.
Yes. No, they say in America, I've read, they'll go and interview people, Generation Alpha or millennials, and they'll say, well, my boss is unreasonable because he expects me to take time from going to the gym and hanging out with my friends. I mean, that's more important than having a job. But this is unsustainable, obviously, and it's hastening the fissioning and breakup of society. In the United States, the superficial thing is you have Trump people versus anti-Trump, but it goes way beyond that. There are people who go to church. There are a minority. The fissures are there in every town, and all it will take is a serious economic crisis, and you're going to find massive violence. And how long it takes to develop, I don't know. I hope I'm gone by then. But
because of all the natural structures of kinship, blood, community, religion are taken away.
That's right.
That's the point where violence is imminent, when the nation fall apart, when a serious crisis is threatening the whole.
That's right, exactly. Here's a small example. America's been plagued by gang violence since, for a very long time, certainly in a very big way since World War II.
Yeah.
And why? Well, some of it has to do with ethnicity, but a lot of it has to do with in inner city neighborhoods, black and white. A lot of boys grow up without fathers. They grow up without male role models. All their teachers are women. All the social workers who hand out the money, they're all women. And so an old friend of mine, George Gilder, wrote a very important book back in the 70s called Sexual Suicide. And basically and before that he wrote a book on the gangs. And he went and talked with them and he lived with them. And the gang is a surrogate family. It replaces the family.
Yeah.
It's the gang, the
it's
neighborhood.
The brotherhood.
That's what
it provides a code of honor.
Yes, and as unpleasant as these people are, because they're violent, they're drug addicted, they're everything bad about them. But it's like people in prison. You're in prison for 20 or 30 years. They get married. Because they're making a grotesque imitation of what is inevitable in human society. And so all it will take is a destruction and the natural genetic programming of the human race, which I believe comes from the creator. If you want to talk about a creator, then just say, fine, I'm a Darwinist, and we've evolved like this for millions and millions of years. We cannot escape that. If we live in a manner inconsistent with our nature, then what's left is what we have now. Once these artificial structures that have replaced real human life, once they break up, then you will see a revival. Even now, there are some sort of silly, misguided young people, but they're living off the grid. They don't know anything about farming. They don't know anything but they'll move out into the country but because way down deep in them there is this dream. Their longings in everyday life with their iPhone and their computer and everything. God knows, I have all that junk in my office and with me right now. But all of that provides no genuine human satisfaction. And so, even the 60s hippie movement, as silly as it was, and I lived through that period, and I knew a lot of these people, what they wanted was something like their dream of a medieval society.
Yeah,
It's not what they
authenticity.
did.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not what they did, because drugs
Back to
and
nature.
promiscuous sex.
Yes.
They had no sense of responsibility. They couldn't even bathe. But if you look at if you look at popular songs, the songs are all about an agrarian, rustic kind of life where people are happy, they live together, and
Having a homestead, raising your own kids.
Yeah.
Be happy. Yeah. Okay.
There's a movie which was hated at the time by conservatives, Easy Rider.
Yeah.
You know, they go to a farm in the early scene of the movie, and Peter Fonda, terrible actor, Peter Fonda says to the farmer, he says, "You got a good thing going here, man. You're doing your own thing in your own time." And of course, the farmer looks at him as if he's crazy, because he is crazy. I mean, he's a cocaine dealer. But the fact is, that is the underlying message of the movie, that, you know, it's the cocaine dealer who represents modern American society, and then here's the alternative if you want to take it. And once things really go to smash, and it doesn't have to be all over at the same time, but, you know, people are abandoning New York, people are abandoning California and Los Angeles, and they think, unfortunately, they bring the diseases of those places wherever they go. They go to Colorado, they ruin Colorado. They go from Connecticut to Vermont to now Maine is being ruined by these people. Okay. The Carolinas, where I grew up, are being ruined by these urban immigrants from the Northeast. Nonetheless, what's the dominant trend of the past 50 years? It's people who are dropping out, and it's become the American dream. But once things come to smash, then a few people will survive.
But you expect a big disaster.
Probably. It's hard because, you know, the American ruling class is the people who actually run the show. They're fairly clever. They don't have they only look at the quarterly bottom line. And that's very unfortunate because, for example, the Chinese look in periods of centuries. We look in periods of 3 or 4 months.
Yes.
And that's not good strategic planning. But faced with complete collapse and dissolution, those people will do everything they can. And there will probably be something like a really hard state police crackdown to prevent things from, and that will produce more dissolution and more violence. And in a small way, I think that's happening. That's happening even right now as we speak. Like the demonstrations that broke out in Minneapolis, Minnesota, over a crackdown on illegal immigrants, especially Somali immigrants, and you have these really ridiculous middle-class people going out and attacking the federal authorities. Because their religion is being nice to people that you have nothing in common with.
Yeah, well, they have an ideology they fight for and they want to die for.
That's right.
There is martyrship in those. There is a sense of martyrship in those protesters from the left who want to fight the border policies of Trump.
Yes. But as soon as they get arrested, they scream about inhumane treatment.
Okay, yeah.
You know, I was reading the death of St. Polycarp, and, you know, they come for him, and the police says, "Look, I've got some prayers that I want to say before," and so but look. I've got some people who help me. Well, sit down and they'll feed you and give you food. And I don't hold it against you. You're just doing your job. I mean, in fact, all those these are very authentic martyrdom stories because we have firsthand accounts. They're not like a lot of the later stuff, which gets a little, flinch, a little dubious. But these are authentic stories, and these early Christians, both in Egypt and the Middle East, they just said, well, you have your job to do, and I'm not going to change my mind. You can forget about that. Yes, you can rip all my body to pieces, but they never complain. They never complain. And whereas these people, if one night in jail and they're screaming bloody murder about how they've been persecuted.
Well, they see it as part of their resistance to demonstrate, to resist, and then to resist their own arrest and
Yes. And then to whine about it forever.
okay. Yeah. Well, your book is full of beautiful arguments about why human nature, as we know it, has never been different from it.
That's right.
And that we can try to run away from it, but it has always been the same. And that argument is it is a part of arguments that those are intertwined, I think, or interconnected with each other. So you make the argument that marriage is very crucial for human beings.
Yes.
That children presuppose parenting, a
Yes.
man and a wife, a father
right.
and a mother. Those father and mother presuppose marriage. The state is not an invention of families. So the state as we know it, of course. And that is beautiful in harmony with what I know from encyclicals, older encyclicals from popes,
Yes.
and Thomas Aquinas, that states that all the authority actually, so also the state, but all authority comes from the fathers,
That's right.
as he says. So, and that's confirmed by papal encyclicals in the 19th century that say that there is no political power that's not legitimized by the natural authority of the fathers. So what's the whole difference between authority and power?
Power, if I have a gun and put it to your head, I can make you do many things. I can make you give me your money. I can make you give me your automobile. I can make you fight in the army. Authority is the ability to be obeyed without coercion. In other words, if a father tells his children, you can't go out after 8 o'clock, or you must do this, you must do that. Yes, Father. They do it because they know that he is the responsible person. I'm not talking about a disordered family. I'm talking about a family of the traditional type. And so the capacity of having obedience without coercion, and it's accepted. And whether it's the power of the father and the mother over their children, or the power of the church, or the power of a king, or a democratically elected government, when we make too many distinctions about, oh, well, good government is democratic, bad government is monarchical or fascistic
Autocratic,
or whatever.
yeah.
We make up all these things.
Yeah.
There are basically, and Aristotle talked about the different forms of government, but really there are two kinds of government. One is legitimate government, and the other is tyrannical government. Legitimate government says, I want you to do the things that you know you're supposed to do because it's in the law, it's in our tradition. We're not going to change the law or the custom. We're not going to say tomorrow property is theft. You can't hold on to your property. We're not going to redefine marriage. We're not going to redefine the human race. And it's the way it's always been. Whereas if a government says to you, I know that up until now we've said that marriage is between a man and a woman, but we've changed our mind now. And if you don't accept this, then you're going to lose your business, you're going to lose your job, you're going to be put in jail ultimately as an unsocial member of society. That's illegitimate. I would say every government that I know of in the West today is illegitimate in that it reinvents customs and traditions and overthrows things the way any dictator would do, the way Hitler or Stalin or the French Revolution government, any dictatorship does what these people do. And in fact, ancient tyrants did very little of that because they came to power through popularity, but they would still then revolutionize the Constitution. Anytime you want to change the fundamentals of the way people have governed themselves and force them to accept it, you have now an illegitimate dictatorial government.
That's what happened in ancient Rome.
Yeah.
And it will happen here as well.
But you know, even when Augustus came to power, when Octavian came to power, Julius Caesar was quite a troublemaker, but when Octavian came to power, his friends settled him down. And, you know, he said, okay, I'm not going to be anything. You could just call me, I'll just be the consul for a while, and I'll be the Pontifex Maximus. And, but behind the scenes, I'll have veto power over who becomes the next consul. I'll do this, but we'll pretend it's the old republic. He did everything he could to maintain the fiction. And it was only under Septimius Severus that it just said, look, the army is all that counts. I have the power, you don't, so just no more palaver in the Senate. He told his sons, take care of the army, don't worry about anybody else. And that's the big change. But in our society, we believe, and it's a long history we're not going to go into, but it's the accomplishment of the British Whigs that they overthrew the monarchy, which had been bound by law and custom and tradition. When Charles I was executed in the name of the king, and during the English Revolution, he said, "I die preserving the liberties to preserve the liberties of the English people." In the next 100 years, Parliament did things that no king would ever have done. They revolutionized society, and they said, because we have the power of the people. Now, of course, only like 10% of the people in Britain had the vote, but it didn't matter. And even as Britain became more democratic, the government assumed more and more right in the name of the people to change the Constitution, to change the laws. This is what brought about the American Revolution. Because the American cause was really pretty trivial, you know, some taxes and you know, there was no reason for a revolution, except that the Americans still believed they were operating according to the old rules of the British nation. And the Parliament said, we can do anything we want to. We're elected by the people. And it was not until Lincoln in the United States that our country adopted the same principle. Majority rule means black can be white tomorrow. Things that were legal yesterday will be illegal tomorrow. And ever since that revolution, called the American Civil War, ever since that revolution, the United States has been increasingly governed, as all countries in Europe have been governed, by governments that in the name of the people can change everything.
Yeah, but they still claim that they rely on the authority of all the people.
Yeah.
And that there is that the nation state is somewhere rooted in the world, not of the fathers, but of all the voters.
That's right. And as a result, you either take it or you go to jail.
Yeah.
People who used to say, well, I live in a free country, and I said, okay, here's a piece of paper, the American dollar bill. I said, first of all, it's got Masonic symbolism. So you're asked to say, you have to accept these Masonic principles, right? And I said, well, what does it say here? This worthless piece of paper is legal tender for all debts. So I can't say, I want gold or I want labor. The government says, I go to jail if I don't take this paper. Now, they've reinvented something. I mean, that's not the way currency is supposed to operate. It's not supposed to be, trust me, I'm your government. No, I'm not arguing for a hard money revolution or anything like that. I'm simply saying that the things that in the West we now take for granted. For example, my parents lived during the 1930s. When they started passing new tax laws. And so the government in the United States, ever since then, has taken a certain percentage of your income from your employer. And then you have to argue with the government at the end of the year to get your money back. I said to my parents when I was 20, I said, how could you let that happen? I said, you voted for Roosevelt 4 times and he did this to you? And to this day, I said he was dictator for life. Yeah. He had to die to get out of office.
Yeah.
He's our Julius Caesar. Now, I mean, these are all tyrannical behavior of government, and it's not just the United States, it's not just Britain and Canada, it's everywhere. And and when you develop the European Union, of course, fewer and fewer people control the destinies of more and more people. I mean, the agricultural...
The whole thing, right? A lot of people, we don't have a society which is ruled by the middle class.
That's right.
And which produces healthy elites and which provide labor for the labor class. We have in the Middle Ages, the middle class had the power. They
That's right.
had the guilds, and those had the powers in all the cities in Europe. So there was no ruling class. There was maybe a ruling class, but they were strongly held and limited by the guilds and the middle class, and the power to control the elites, to control the state, to control politicians has gone completely.
Here in Pisa, as in Florence and Siena and Arezzo, all throughout central Italy, in the later Middle Ages, they formed every trade had a guild, a società. And they were the gold workers, the money lenders, the wool workers. And here especially the people who owned fleets. They had consortiums, and all of these they got together and we need to find some way of working together in common. So they called it the comune, and we go, well, that's the state. But it was under the control of all these commercial guilds, but also aristocratic families would have their say also. But it was, in fact, the state is the creation of these commercial and industrial guilds. And they made each one could govern itself. Like they set prices, quality control, they could kick people out, they could even punish.
The neighborhood in a city was autonomous.
Exactly.
Because it was governed by one guild.
That's right.
And a guild was maybe a collection of tens or maybe 100 men.
Yes.
That worked in that particular guild. And then they controlled also the complete neighborhoods.
That's right.
So it was autonomous, and all those autonomous neighborhoods together had representatives in the city council.
That's right.
And they governed the city, but the city was not an autonomous entity.
No. And of course it was full of conflict and full of rivalry.
Yeah, but that belongs
that's
to
energy.
life. That's life.
That's energy.
Yeah.
When Pisa, just to stick it to its rivals, Lucca and Firenze, built that cathedral there is the first major full-sized cathedral construction built since the fall of Rome. Okay, it's one of the most amazing things that ever happened.
It's almost 1,000 years old.
Yes.
And it's so overwhelming. It's the most beautiful church I've ever seen.
If you go to Siena, they built one a little later, very beautiful, although the Sienese, they kept on trying to rebuild it and screwed it up. But the Sienese hear that Florence is building a new big cathedral. Well, we can't let them get away with that. But in each one of these neighborhoods, for example, Pisa had like 4 major neighborhoods defined by gates of the cities that were also church parishes. And they had competition with it. And so even here to this day, they revive this. They have a thing they call the Gioco de Ponte. They have a tug of war across one of the bridges of the Arno. What they used to do is they would come out with wooden shields and huge big wooden clubs and beat each other's brains out and then throw them in the water. But it was the competition between neighborhoods and then the competition between cities produced the Renaissance. It produced the most beautiful outpouring. You can't understand either the art or Dante or any of the rest of us unless you understand how deeply committed they were. Dante says he's in exile, living, I think, in Ravenna when he writes the lines, and he talks about the bells of San Giovanni, the baptistry, which you can hear from if you go to his home in Florence. You can hear, but that's for him. Florence was hearing the bells of the neighborhood church, and of course now they make fun of in Italian campanellismo, that is people who are attached to the sound of their church bell because they love their neighborhood.
Okay, it's not allowed. It's bad.
No, it's not allowed. Well, in England, they're shutting down because Muslims don't like the sound of the church bell. So
Yeah.
they don't silence the muezzins chanting from their with loudspeakers, but they do silence the church bell.
Yeah. Yeah. Church bells are annoying, yes, but the Moesim, they can do
Yes.
whatever they want because it's diversity.
That's right.
Yes. Nice. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Fleming. It was a great honor to meet you. As I said, you're one of the heroes of my 20s when I was a student. Along with Robert Nisbet, you know him very well.
Yes.
He was very praiseful about your book.
Yes, he was. He was very kind.
Yeah. Robert Nisbet, I think I have every book of him in my shelf, and I've read him a lot. Beautiful book on conservatism, small one,
Yes.
and, but a lot of
His
beautiful
Quest
books.
for Community.
Quest?
And,
Oh, yes.
His
Yeah,
book on
yeah.
authority. I
Yeah.
mean, all of this was.
Yeah.
And the conservative movement never took him seriously because he was not a movement
Really?
person. Well, he was a famous person, and he had, not many conservative academics had a named chair at Columbia University. But he had started out. He wasn't identified as a conservative till, say, the 1960s, but he was a very independent-minded person. He followed his nose, followed his research. A lot of his work was. It's still extremely important to read.
Yes, I agree. He has passed away a long time ago. I think 20 years, 30,
Yes.
30 years.
Yes, more like 30.
Yep. So I've never had the honor to meet him, but this was very special for me to talk about your book and your
Oh, thank
works.
you.
And The Properties of Blood
Yes,
is part one of a new trilogy, right?
yes,
And it appeared in 2014.
yes.
And
No, more like about 4 years ago.
4 years ago, 20.
So I'm
21?
finishing
Okay.
the first volume was subtitled "The Reign of Love" on affection, neighborhood, and things like that. And the next volume is on hostility, and how the necessity of
It's about love and
competition,
hate.
violence, dueling. It's a lot of blood. And then the third one is actually the book I started to write 30 years ago on the moral responsibility within family relationships from birth to death. And
Wow.
it's actually, it's written, I just have to sit down and clean it up.
I will look forward to that.
Okay, you may have noticed that I was talking to an idol from my college days. I greatly admire this book. Anyone who has done this has accomplished a tremendous feat. I continue my journey with gratitude for this encounter. In the meantime, I'm overseeing the German and English translations of my book on geopolitics, Permafrost, in the hope that they'll be published sometime this year or next. This is the promised sequel to the Triads. The sequel to Permafrost will focus on authority, and Fleming's book was the inspiration for this as well. It will delve much more deeply into the realities, possibilities and limitations of human nature. Here and there in this conversation we've touched on themes that will be further explored in the book on authority. New guests in this interview series will follow later this year, and you can also look forward to a more detailed overview of the main themes of the conversations so far, an intermezzo. I can't wait, and I hope you can't either.